of an ongoing series, Fueling Ohio's Future, which is presented by AEP and Battelle in partnership with the Ohio State University Office of Energy and the Environment and with support from Columbia Gas. Today's forum, which is Tales of Shale Part 3 Policy, is supported by Steptoe & Johnson and MS Consultants. So please join me in thanking those sponsors. Okay, information about our panelists is in your programs. I'm not going to duplicate that. I will say that the two panelists know their stuff. They are, I don't think we could have two more knowledgeable and articulate spokespersons for their policy positions. So we have, as the first panelist, we have the Deputy Director of the Ohio Environmental Council, Jack Shaner. Jack, thank you for being here. And our second panelist is Tom Stewart. Tom is Executive Vice President of the Ohio Oil and Gas Association. Serving as the moderator today is Mark Kovac. Mark is head of the chief of the State House Bureau for Dick's Newspapers and the Youngstown Vindicator. So, Mark, with that, the microphone is yours, and panelists, thanks for being here.
Just to remind you, around 12:55, we'll start taking some questions from the audience, so start getting ready to do that, 12:55. I don't want to be too repetitive of past forums you've had, but it might be a good idea to start out by putting a frame around our policy debate. And to do that, there was a production report issued by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources a couple weeks ago that showed we went from 2 to 87 production wells in the state in the Utica Shale. Those wells pumped nearly 646,000 barrels of oil, about 12.8 billion cubic feet of natural gas. The head of the agency called this potentially the beginning of a boom in the state, a beginning of a historic era. I've heard a lot of people since then say this is disappointing. These numbers aren't anywhere where they're supposed to be. I'm curious, what do those numbers say about where we are in the shale play? And Tom, if we can start with you.
Thank you, Mark. I think what they tell us is that we're in the absolute infancy of the Utica shale play in the state of Ohio. It so far has been a transformational event, particularly for my industry. Everything's changed as far as we are concerned about how we operate and how we think about exploration techniques. Definitely the production numbers point to something that we've always suspected would be the case, that this is really a natural gas play, and it is not an oil play. We have high hopes that the so-called oil window will open up, but there's obviously technological challenges to getting that done. And if my industry is good at one thing, it's at doing research and development and solving technological challenges. I mean, if you even think about where our industry has been just 10 years ago and how we have transformed American energy policy based upon horizontal drilling techniques, going to resource shale plays, going to the mother lode where the source rocks are at instead of conventional reservoirs. That's only an event that's been in 10 years. So hopefully we'll see this happen in Ohio. But the production numbers, I think, may not reach the trend necessary for some of the very large producers, but major independents are still very interested in this play, and I just think it needs a lot of work.
Jack, what about it? 688,000 barrels of brine last year.
Thank you. That's right. That's some of the byproducts that we don't hear a lot about, certainly from some of the hype and some of the expectations here. So to be fair, Tom's right. It's early in this play. We'll see how big a boom or bust it turns out to be. It does appear, as Tom said, to be primarily natural gas. So far, it doesn't look like a lot of the oil. Now, to be fair to Tom, he's stated in the press that technology eventually will probably help pull out that oil, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Tom isn't right. But at this time, it's that Harrison County or Carroll County, 4 or 5 counties over there in eastern Ohio that looks to be the deep play there in the shale gas. Now, you know, will this be sustainable for Ohio? We've had coal booms and busts in Ohio. You know, you'd think, you look at Ohio, you look at a state like West Virginia. West Virginia Virginia, Kentucky, with millions, billions of dollars of sales from coal from those states. But you drive through a lot of that coal country in Kentucky and West Virginia, and you don't see a lot of the local folk doing real well. A lot of those dollars went off to Wall Street, New York City, elsewhere. They got rich. So will we have sustainable development here? Will Governor Kasich, you've heard him talk about how many of these jobs are going to be going to Ohioans. We're all enjoying low natural gas prices today, and we should acknowledge there are benefits, absolutely, from oil and gas. We all use them to get here today. We all use them to heat our houses. We will again. But, these markets for natural gas historically have been very volatile. Wasn't the natural gas industry, but somebody told us 50 years ago or so that nuclear power would be too cheap to meter, and hopefully nobody took that to the bank. And hopefully no one is taking to the bank today's low prices natural gas, because this has historically been a volatile market. So it's early on. We'll see where it ends up. But yes, there certainly are some toxic and nasty dark underside to this industry. Maybe we'll talk about a little bit about that today, Mark.
But what's interesting about that, Mark, is if you take a look at long-term future contracts being traded on the New York Mercantile Exchange, going out years, what they say is that volatility in the natural gas marketplace has been washed out. And those are people that are betting on the market going forward in the future and placing their hedges on that. Volatility has washed out. Natural gas storage is flush and is expected to remain flush. Everything about energy supply has fundamentally changed, and people who use it and buy it and depend upon it to do their businesses outside of my industry all know that and recognize that.
Something else that's changed is Aubrey McClendon, what was that, 16 months ago, Tom, you and I were up at Ohio State, Governor Kasich's Energy Summit, and he said this would be the biggest thing to hit Ohio since the plow. Yeah. Aubrey McClendon's gone. Chesapeake has sold off a ton of their leases here in Ohio. We'll see where we end up. Maybe need to take our temperature again a year or two or 5 or 10 years from now.
Oh, that's a really interesting viewpoint. That was a pretty interesting forum, Jack. Aubrey McClendon changed American oil and gas exploration techniques with a lot of guts and a lot of bravado. And he was famous for making statements that would generate interest behind what he had done. Chesapeake has grew from a very small company very quickly to become the second largest natural gas producer in the United States. And if McClendon can be faulted for anything, he produced too much natural gas, which is what some of the problems that came behind that company. But Chesapeake is not selling acreage because they're disappointed. They are selling acreage to focus in on their core areas, which is primarily Columbiana and Carroll County. And I think that's a wise, prudent business decision that they've made. And you're seeing a lot of the players that have taken out acreage positions in Ohio reshuffling their acreage position to focus in on core areas that are critical to their mission and their business plan. So what they're doing is nothing about the state of the play and everything about where Chesapeake needs to go with their investment strategy and achieve their internal rate of return. So they're just doing the smart thing.
As you can see at this point, Tom and I are going to get through a lot of questions today.
We're still on number one, aren't we, Jack?
Hey, it's hard to get through a week at the State House without hearing from the governor or a Republican lawmaker or somebody in the administration saying that Ohio has some of the toughest regulations on the books dealing with fracking. If this is really a natural gas play, natural gas liquids, what is the state of our regulatory environment? Do we have adequate rules on the books right now, laws on the books to protect the environment and support the industry?
I say yes, Jack says no.
That is correct, and I'd like to expand on Tom's answer. You know, give Governor Kasich credit. He came in and quickly did he and his DNR director, Jim Zeringer, did a gap analysis and found what they identified as several gaps that we were not ready, regulatory speaking, for the shale gas, the horizontal drilling play. And I give the Kasich administration for doing that, for identifying a number of problems, and for making solutions in the General Assembly for adopting, by and large, most of those solutions the governor put forth. This was, I guess, 1 year ago in Senate Bill 315. And we tip our hat to Governor Kasich for that. We also tip our hat that this administration has been decisive when there have been some of the high-profile incidents that nobody likes. I don't think Tom likes these, either the Youngstown dumper, the guy that ordered his employees to back the tanker up, and instead of injecting the waste deep underground where it ought to go, instead flushing it down a tributary to the Mahoning River. Kasich's team got all over that guy. Wants to put him out of business. They're doing the right thing on that. And sadly, just last night, the DNR has announced that back in the middle of May, I guess it was, St. Clairsville, some clown backed up the tanker and let her roll down the hill, literally into a farm pond. I mean, it sounds like I'm giving you some Enviro Hollywood script. It's a true story. Check it out on DNR's website. So I credit the Kasich administration. They're backing up their words of they're not going to let scufflaws get away with things, and they have been all over these, and I salute them for that. However, I would also suggest we got a long way to go, and this is where I think Tom and I probably have our greatest difference here, of are we adequately managing the risk? We all understand we take risks every day. Everybody took a risk just traveling to work today. We understand that, so we try to manage risk. This is the question. Are we adequately managing the risk? I believe we are not. I'd be happy to detail these in a little bit here, but maybe I'll give equal time, this time to Tom.
Thanks, Jack.
I'm trying to set him up, so I'm trying to do it.
And you did a fine job. There's always going to be criminal activity no matter what business activity is going on. There's always going to be somebody that will abscond with the funds. There's always going to be somebody that will, by their acts, will put a bad light on the total industry. What happened in Youngstown, short of letting that person go through a fair trial and protect his constitutional rights to due process, I have my views about how that will end up, and we have been very outspoken in saying that if laws were broken and this person purposely polluted and avoided his obligations under the law, then that person should suffer the full consequences of the law plus none. And in fact, the federal government has stepped into that case underneath Clean Water Act and RCRA and I think a few other the major environmental laws coming down on his activities. What happened over by the Ohio River, we don't know this company. We're not aware of their activities, but my association's position would remain the same. If crimes are committed, then I'll be the first, if convicted, to pick up a hammer and help them build the scaffold.
I'd like to say, it doesn't take a gap analysis, though, to figure out we got some real serious problems here in Ohio, both in our current laws adequate and is enforcement adequate. Excuse me, we've got, and I'd like to go through some here. I got a top 10 list of more law changes we need, but we're still waiting for, the rule changes to be in effect from the statutes that were passed a year ago. Now, government moves slowly. Governor Kasich's trying to speed that up at the speed of business. But we'd sure like to see DNR get on the stick and get those rules in place to enforce those statutes that were just passed a year ago, let alone going back to year 2009, I think it was, when Governor Kasich administration and former Senate President Niehaus passed Senate Bill 165. There are still regulations from that not yet on the books, the specific rules to enforce those. And speaking of enforcement, there was a major review of Ohio and 5 other states, oil and gas producing states, conducted by an environmental organization called Earthworks, looked at data from each of those states' DNR, from those states' regulatory entities for oil and gas. And they found consistent across the board, and I'm sorry to say, including here in Ohio, a lack of enforcement. And it starts with a dearth of inspectors. Now, to Kasich's credit, he is doubling the budget of that oil and gas division of DNR in this budget. And we salute him for that, and we support that. I think, Tom, we're teamed up with you in supporting that. We also see that he's going to increase the number of inspectors. That's a very good thing. But, ladies and gentlemen, there's 64,000 active wells in Ohio. Even if we get, or as soon as we get to 100 inspectors, which I don't think is expected to happen this year or even necessarily after this budget, that would be 1 inspector for 640 active wells. active wells. Now there's over 250,000 total wells in Ohio, both active and inactive, and wells that need to be plugged, and old idle and orphan wells out there. So now we're up to one inspector for every 2,500 wells. Is that enough? Finally, and I hear Tom chomping at the bit here.
My turn, Jack.
Not yet, sir. So when we do find inspections, according to the report, Ohio is a little reluctant to hand out fines. In fact, there was less than $20,000 in penalties handed out in year 2010. You may think, well, great, things must be all well and rosy in Ohio, and if there's a few fines being handed out, mind you, a $20,000 fine relative to a single Utica well which would gross over $1 million, doesn't look like much of an incentive. So one of the things we ought to get is a corporate death penalty, a scarlet letter law. That is, if, and Tom's right, after due process, if the character in Youngstown is found guilty, that guy should not only lose his current permit, which DNR has suspended, he ought to be totally, his ability, his right to ever do business in the state of Ohio again on anything should be permanently revoked. These are some of the reforms we desperately need in Ohio.
Tom, before you respond, on DNL, not to get down in the weeds, but that company's trying to get its permits back. It said its owner was not acting on behalf of the company when he allegedly directed those folks to dump that fracking fluid into that storm sewer. Should that company get its permit back if the owner said he wasn't acting on behalf of the business?
Well, if you're a person who's responsible for a company and you're an officer, and my understanding is the allegations that he directed him to do it, and then I think that he should be denied permits and denied ability to work in the state of Ohio. I don't think anybody in my industry disagrees with that. I think we got to be careful about how we couch people doing business. Most oil and gas producers operate hundreds of wells. You're supposed to, for example, have a sign at your well identifying the permit number and the name of the well. If that were to be fade, should this person be a felon? Should he be denied his ability to operate in the state of Ohio, or should he be notified by the inspector that you got a faded sign? Why don't you go out there and fix it? To ODNR's credit, through both Democrat and Republican administrations and various views of oil and gas activity, they've always tried to identify compliance issues and get them resolved instead of trying to send people to jail. However, when we did Senate Bill 165, and both Jack and I worked very hard on that legislation under then Senate Pro Tem Tom Niehaus, we dramatically upgraded enforcement abilities, including creating a device called material and substantial violation that gave them the tools to more aggressively pursue scuffles. Is that how you say that? And I like that word.
That's right, Tom.
And if it had not been, and frankly, OGA was the lead proponent for that bill, and if it had not been for the passage of Senate Bill 165, the expeditious enforcement of the law that happened in the DNL case would not have been possible. So I agree with Jack that we need to constantly look at ways to improve the regulatory process and make sure that everything's efficient and that it meets the type of activity that's going on out there now. But we've got to keep everything in perspective. For example, Jack says there's 260,000 wells out there we need to worry about. About 200,000 of those were drilled pre-regulatory and are plugged and abandoned. They're not wells that exist anymore. So it's not fair to say that we need inspectors to worry about something that was plugged and abandoned when my grandfather was in the business in 1910. Also, there's many wells out there that are very low, marginally producing wells. They could be a gas well that's simply a pipe and a valve flowing into a gas line out there. Should we be expending resources that an inspector has to go and see that every day? I don't think so. I think what the inspectors really need to be worrying about is being out on drilling sites or when wells are initially turned on, but making sure that pipe is set correctly according to the permit conditions, that the cement jobs went correctly, so that the pipe is allowed to do its job and isolate and protect reservoirs and freshwater drinking resources. I think that's really where we need these people to be at, and that is where the DNR right now is focusing their activities, I think, correctly. But, you know, it's easy to throw out terms like 260,000 wells out there. Representative Hagan's famous for doing that. There is not 260,000 wells out here in the state of Ohio. The vast majority of those have been plugged. And then Jack brought up the Idle and Orphan Well program. I think my association has been the lead cheerleader for Idle and Orphan Well program because this is the oldest producing province in the nation, frankly in the world, bar none. And there's a lot of historic production out there for which there's no identifiable owner. My members want that stuff plugged worse than you do because it may interfere with future development of the lease and is a threat to health, safety, and the environment. And we have worked to make sure that taxation policies in there to directly fund the INO program, the second oldest in the nation, and we expect the department to use the money that came from the industry taxation policy to get those things done. Am I going too long, Jack? Oh, sorry.
No.
Well, Jack, before you say what you're going to say, DNL and the affiliated companies up in Mahoning County, this, company over in Belmont County, as soon as the state found out what they were allegedly doing, went in, shut them down, stopped the activity. That sounds like state policy is working the way it's supposed to.
DNR got the tip. DNR got the tip on what was happening. They were out there that night, filmed it, and the next day got him.
DNR got an anonymous tip on the Youngstown dumper, agree, that's correct. And the St. Clairsville incident last week came in through Ohio EPA, got another anonymous tip, that's great.
And they got him.
I hope all of our anonymous tipsters out there are getting their Wheaties and getting their eyes and ears on because we're going to need them. Now, Tom talked about the 260,000 wells, the total wells in Ohio. Okay, let's take those off the table. Let's just concentrate on the active wells, just the 64,000. 91% of those had no inspection in year, I think it was 2010, according to the Earthworks report. Now, I agree with Tom. The top priority should be let's be on site where there's a new well being drilled and make sure that that is being installed correctly, that everybody agrees that a most critical moment in time is when the well is being constructed. Agree with that. But those inspectors are also responsible for all the wells in their territory. Even again, we get up to 100 inspectors. That's 640 wells per inspector. Is that enough? Last point is, so DNR has reported since 2001. This is in the Columbus Dispatch, a series a couple years ago. Over 3,000 incidents in Ohio. Tom talks about paperwork violations. I would agree with Tom. No, nobody should be going to jail for, their sign wasn't on straight or had a footprint on it or somebody didn't fill out a, cross an I or dot a T right. But, DNR, including those violations, included defective well casings, leaking wells, spills, leaks, unlawful disposal of brine, failure to restore land at a drill site, pollution, contamination. Those are not minor paperwork violations. Those are serious violations, and we should put a stop to that.
And your ability to cite those means that those were inspected and are part of the process.
And let's hope there was a lot of tipsters out there helping those inspectors out.
Well, I'm one of them, so.
Okay, Tom, to the average person walking down the street, these energy companies are just rolling in dough. Why in the world can't they pay a little more into the state coffers via an increased tax on horizontal hydraulic fracturing?
Well, your question mark is why doesn't my association support the severance tax, correct? My association doesn't support the severance tax because, one, we believe that this opportunity for the state of Ohio, and particularly for Eastern Ohio, will succeed if producers take their net revenues and plow it back into the ground, which is how they arrive at the funds to replace the reserves and expand growth and opportunity, one. We oppose it because you may look at the sweet spot of the play and say you can impose a tax on wells right directly in the sweet spot, and surely they can pay that, and they probably can work that into their economics if you're in the sweet spot in Belmont County or Harrison County. The issue is, do we want to close down the exploration window or not? And by looking at any one company and saying, well, hell, you can pay 4 or 5 or 6%, it doesn't matter. What they're saying is we can run an internal rate of return calculation and we'll judge it based upon the geology that we validated and match that up against our budgetary constraints and and what our board of directors expect us to achieve on rate of return. And maybe we'll drill this well or drill that well, or maybe we'll just move on. And in fact, there is companies that have just moved on here in the state of Ohio. Now, my members that have traditionally been here in the state of Ohio have held by production acreage and relationships with landowners across most of eastern Ohio. It is their opportunity that will be lost if you close down the exploration window. We also believe that if you do direct analysis on decline curves, which is something that the production numbers did not talk about, that you will find that the payback period on these is stretched out on average between 8 to 10 years on a reasonable decline curve based upon several petroleum engineering studies. And in fact, one of the very well-known commentators, Bernstein, who analyzed the DNR reports just from several weeks ago, came out and said in their analysis that each one of these wells on average will produce about 100,000 barrels of oil expected ultimate recovery over the lifetime of the well. That is an amazingly close number to the 2 petroleum engineering studies that we've done in state and out of state on the potential. So what we're concerned about is maintaining the economic opportunity for eastern Ohio, for the existing industry in the state of Ohio, and by applying 4% gross receipts tax, which is 15 times higher than the business taxes that anybody else is expected to pay in this state, that you are closing down opportunity. Now, the governor's fond of saying, and his representatives are fond of saying, that it's 20 cents. It's just 20 cents. He holds up those 2 dimes and says, 20 cents and it's $100 oil. What's the matter with you, Tom? Why can't you go along with something more than 20 cents? Here's what they never tell you. They never tell you what it took to find that barrel of oil, which the Wall Street Journal said in an article a week and a half ago was $70. They never tell you what it took to lift that barrel of oil 7,000 feet from below the ground to the surface. Then they never tell you what it costs to replace that barrel of oil, plus find more. And by the time you get all those calculations in, you're closing in on $80 to $90 a barrel of oil. And now your profit is $5 on that 20 cents. Everybody else in the state of Ohio, except for very limited circumstances, agreed in 2005 that the most gross receipts tax they could possibly pay was 26 cents on $100 of revenue, called the CAT tax. Oil is 20 cents a barrel, a little bit underneath the CAT tax, and natural gas equates to about 1% gross receipts underneath the current formula, 4 times the CAT tax, and we pay the CAT tax too. So I'm trying to understand why one industry is being singled out. And the answer always comes back. It says, well, we're trying to export Ohioans' tax burdens onto the back of out-of-state producers. I thought Ohio was open for business. At least that's what I was told 2.5 years ago. And that's not a very business-friendly way of inviting people into your state. But by and large, what will happen if this play is successful is that technology will flow downhill, costs will be reduced, which is necessary in order to make this play work, and will solve technological problems, and those are opportunities for Ohioans, not necessarily for somebody out of Fort Worth, Texas. And that's why we care so much about this severance tax proposal. Thankfully, the Ohio General Assembly seems to be agreeing with that.
Mark, looks like you hit a nerve on that one. Other stuff flowing downhill, Tom talked about, they don't talk about the cost to lift this oil and gas out of the ground. They don't talk about the expenses. I don't know if Tom, they're enrolling into that either, the cost of the major TV and ad blitz, which is going on now. You saw, you can't turn a TV or radio on or look at the newspaper or your internet and I'd see an ad from the oil and gas industry. I guess they looked at the polls a year or two ago that showed Ohioans kind of split. Ohioans were saying, yeah, we want those jobs and investment, but then actually were more than that, saying, but we're very concerned about the impacts to our air and land and water. And so we've got a big blitz coming on here of the ads, and I suppose they're affecting public opinion. But let's get away from opinion. Let's look at Ernst & Young, the prominent CPA firm that did an examination of Governor Kasich's proposal a couple of years ago. I think it's similar to what he had proposed again in his budget this go-around. Looked at, I think it was 8 states, oil, gas producing states, including neighboring states to Ohio and also major oil and gas producing states around the country, including Texas. And according to Ernst & Young, that tax, if it were adopted, Ohio would still be rock bottom low, would still have a low rate of taxation. And it's hard to understand how that could scare somebody out when you're seeing, the likes of Chesapeake with $1 billion worth of land purchases one day, and then a year or two later starting to divest of those. Also, it's hard to understand or shed a tear for Tom when I think the governor's proposal would have exempted the vertical drilling, the traditional vertical industry in Ohio. I believe, and we haven't endorsed Governor Kasich's proposal, so I don't know every aspect of it, but I'm pretty sure he was exempting the tax increase from the vertical and applying it only to the horizontal, which is the big time Exxon and Chevron and Anadarko and the other big boys.
Well, Jack, the Ernst & Young study is almost everybody universally recognizes that it was blown. It overestimated production by many factors, underestimated cost by many factors, and doesn't match up to any known petroleum engineering evaluation of what the Utica play could produce or is producing. Ernst & Young is not even relevant to the discussion anymore. Regarding the severance tax proposal and the issue to relieve vertical producers of severance tax under 10 MCF a day, my association has always preached, and my members have always accepted the concept that this is a very complex and diverse industry, and no matter how big you are or how small you are, you have an obligation through the severance tax to support the oil and gas regulatory process. And that's an obligation the public expects of us because of the nature of industry, and that's why we've always supported the severance tax being used as law requires today to be solely and exclusively directed toward the oil and gas regulatory program and the geology department over at DNR. So that's why we supported, as you recall, under 165, doubling the severance tax under the Niehaus bill, because the DNR at that time came to us with a very credible concern and a very credible business plan and said, here's what we need to go forward in order to ensure public trust in the regulatory process. This is how we would fund it. And when they showed us the plan, we said, we accept. Now the issue is, how do we get you from where you are right now to where you need to be? And that's what 165 done. That's why we were aggressive proponents for that process. So even from the very smallest producer, based upon their output to the very largest, those people are supporting the public good through their severance taxes for what it should be used for instead of being handed out for a political purpose. What? Plus more. If you're in the oil and gas business, the number one rule of your life is that you must replace your reserves. I know of nobody going out and trying to replace their reserves in the vertical industry, so-called vertical industry, that's looking to get a well making less than 10 MCF a day. We all know where this will lead. We all know that 5 years from now, if we accept this, Jack Shaner will be there saying, you guys aren't supporting the agency, and now we need to triple the tax. So I think we have good policy in place right now, and that's why we didn't bite on that lure.
I would agree with Tom. I do acknowledge that the industry did step up, as Tom's related, when in the Niehaus legislation, when DNR said we need X to this industry's credit, it agreed. We sure haven't seen that out of the coal industry. At the same time, Tom, you remember the Strickland administration asked similarly that the coal industry should be sharing more of their burden of state regulation, move that off the backs of the general taxpayers onto the industry that makes a pretty penny out of mining natural resources. I would also say, though, that we've called for a increase in this severance tax because it's not only the state of Ohio that has a burden, it is also local governments. It is it's the local fire department, it's the local police that's going to be responding to a truck crash or an incident, and we believe that, and also other impacts can be to local communities, and there ought to be a reasonable increase in that severance tax to help those local communities deal with respond to events when they happen.
Well, that's why we have the ad valorem tax, Jack. There's a tax
what?
specific
Which
on
one?
ad valorem tax. There is a
Tom's
tax.
for more taxes. You hearing this?
No, that's why we have the existing ad valorem tax. It's been part of the revised code now for decades. It equates, if you put it into gross receipts concept, it equates to an additional 1% gross receipts tax that's dedicated and goes to local government. It primarily funds schools or whatever the county commissioners think that ought to be funded. But once again, there is a severance tax that equates to a little bit more than 1% gross receipts. That's 4 times the current CAT tax. We pay the CAT too. There's another ad valorem tax that equates to about 1%, so now there's 2%, and that 1%, again, is 4 times the CAT tax that everybody else pays, and we pay the CAT too. So there is funding going to local government, and it was our proposal that was part of, originally considered under 315, a corrupted view of it was put into the budget bill 59 that said we recognize that there is a gap between initial production and initial receipts. That's primarily caused by how you evaluate the timeline on evaluating that. And we said, we'll give you prepayments, local governments. You know, if you want a prepayment, if we get a well, we'll give you a prepayment, and you can amortize that and give us back through our production stream as it grows and becomes normalized. They rejected that. So if they don't want the prepayment, we're fine with that.
All right, let me shut that can of worms for a moment. I'm going to go to the audience in 2 minutes, so if you want to start coming to the microphone, you can do that. That gives you each 1 minute to tell me if you could put anything in the state budget you wanted to. 2 things. What 2 things would you put in the state budget?
It's going to take us a minute to think about that.
Jack, you said you had a list of 10.
I do. I'm trying to winnow it down here. You're asking me to
This is budget issues, Jack.
boil it down here to 2 issues. Tom, go ahead. You're on a roll.
What would I put into the budget bill? I think Ohio has a great opportunity and could create a growth industry by looking at compressed natural gas vehicles, and that there ought to be support for the CNG industry and ways to help the utilities that pipe this gas across Ohio to encourage them to build up infrastructure so that Ohioans can basically fill up for about $1.50 to $1.75 instead of $4. I think there's a lot of things the state of Ohio could do to encourage that. I think that we ought to take the excess severance revenues that are going to be coming, that we all know are coming because apparently the DNR thinks there's a staggering amount of oil and gas out there, that we ought to take some of those severance revenues and rebolster and rejuvenate and recreate the idle and orphan well program so that we can plug these historic wells from over a century ago, and you could create a whole new industry doing that. There's all kinds of creative things we could be doing.
Jack, 1 minute.
Sure, radioactive waste. So the budget and the Senate has just yesterday put back in language that you'll now be seeing. We're going to be seeing radioactive waste going to be mixed with soil and automobile fluff, sawdust to try to dilute and get down under a regulatory threshold radioactive content coming from oil and gas waste from Ohio and from out of state, coming to a solid waste landfill near you. We ought to be at least following the United States EPA, the National Academy of Sciences, and ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, which says essentially if you move it, it's now, it's been enhanced. It is no longer naturally occurring, but it's been technically enhanced and should not be going into these landfills. Secondly, if I had one other thing I could do, I would treat oil and gas the way we treat coal. That is, the public has a robust opportunity to know and comment on proposed permits. Some injection wells, you have like 15 days to comment under Ohio law for oil and gas. Coal, at least 30 days. And also that you'd have a right to appeal the terms and conditions of those permits. Can you believe it? In the United States of America, I don't think Ronald Reagan would understand this. The public in the United States, if you're an affected citizen, you live next to an oil and gas well, you have no right to appeal the terms and conditions of that permit, whereas if it's a coal mine, you certainly do. Something wrong with that picture. We ought to be fixing that.
Okay, so it is Columbus Metropolitan Club's tradition to take audience questions. I'll remind you that these sessions are filmed and broadcast on the Ohio channel or on YouTube.
Tom says, oh, now you tell me.
Yep.
Just kidding.
And so come to the microphone. If you don't, I'm going to let Jack talk about technologically advanced, naturally occurring radioactive materials.
Please, somebody come out.
Yes, hi. My name's Andy Campbell. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. One of the things I've heard about the shale gas play is that some of the gas that's coming out of there, the high-value gases, I guess the butane and ethane, perhaps, and that there's a market for these internationally. And then consequently, I've heard that there's some resistance to the export of the sale of these gas resources, which you would think would benefit all of Ohio and perhaps the nation. Could you comment? I'm curious about the environmental side of this as well in transporting and packaging these for sale, if indeed we're allowed to do that.
The sweet spot of the Utica Shale, Jack's accurate, it's about 5 to 6 counties where you find this. The natural gas being produced there, for the most part, inside the sweet spot, is high BTU gas. Pipeline quality gas is around 1,000 BTUs, British thermal units, energy equivalents. This gas, it rises much more beyond that. Usually consumers like that because their meters turn slower. But on the other hand, there is standards on how you enter, particularly the interstate pipeline system, tariffs, terms, and conditions at the FERC that require that you bring it down to exactly gas quality standards at around 1,000 BTU, or no more than 1,100. So that means that you have to do something. You have to drop out what's creating that BTU value, and those are usually longer chain molecules, bigger than methane. So you have propanes, butanes, isobutane, ethane, which is what the chemical industry likes. They make things out of it. And by going through a process where you severely chill the gas underneath pressure, you will drop those components out and get down to the tail gas at about 1,000 BTU, or it's methane. So there's opportunity there, but not yet. Because right now there's so much ethane being produced across the United States, but particularly here in Appalachia, that dropping ethane out right now actually is a cost instead of a value. You're better off if you could capture that value in the gaseous state to leave it in. But you have to solve problems in order to do that. You have to build pipelines. There's really only 2 places to take ethane these days. It's Mount Belvieu down on the Gulf Coast in Texas, or Sarnia up in Canada. And there's transportation issues. So right now, this thing about liquids uplift, it's real because people use propane. It's real because people use butane. Utica gas is about 50% generally ethane, so it really is a cost issue. Now, to the second part of your question, there is an emerging debate going on in the United States because there's been so much natural gas found because of technology that, frankly, the natural gas marketplace is flooded. Now, we have a valuable resource. What do you do with that? And there is people in the industry and people in policy and people outside of the industry who believe that this is an opportunity to export, to otherwise turn around these LNG facilities, reliquefy it, and send it to more markets. Now, that does a lot for balance of trade issues. Naturally, consumers, and particularly industrial consumers, are all going to say, well, now we have this cheap resource and you want to export it. So now there is a debate. And I've really not come down hard on either side of that debate myself. I think there's a lot of good to be said about exporting American products and doing something about our balance of trade. But we'll see how that thing shapes out. But just 10 years ago, the National Petroleum Council said that, we're going to have to export, we have to get it on boats the way we do crude and bring it to the United States, the only way we're going to be able to survive. Here we are 10 years later, and we're talking about reversing that process. And the Obama administration appears to be intrigued by this. They have approved one LNG exporting facility, and they're looking at others across the nation. There's companies that operate here in the state of Ohio in the utility business that have a big interest in seeing that done, and I think that we ought to listen to their concerns and see how we can help them to get that done.
So one of the implications of the big shale gas play, if it really turns out as big as some folks think, we're going to have more pipelines built in Ohio. We're going to have more of these fractionization processing plants built in Ohio. So what? Well, here's partly so what. Sadly, in that reform bill the Kasich administration pushed last year, the Kasich administration also went along with repealing the power siting board oversight of these small gathering lines.
That's not really accurate, Jack.
Fractionization plants.
Yeah.
Well, hold on, Tom. Yeah. I think I'm right about this.
No, I don't think so.
And this takes away one of the forums for the public to be able to have oversight and to be able to challenge and to weigh in on issues. And Tom, I was there when the PCO chairman was testifying and advocating for this. Secondly is that, we have now with more pipeline production, you saw the newspaper story of a inadvertent return, nice euphemism for, I think the industry calls a frack out. There was benthic clay that was burst through the surface of the ground, a mile and a half long of stream fouled, according to the report, on a wetland, impacted severely. This is the kind of activity we don't want to see in Ohio, that still, with all of our laws and rules and inspectors, has occurred. Finally, I want to point out, we're speaking about gases here, according to a recent GAO report, October 2012, and a study then by Cornell University, looked at and identified potentially estimating some 4% of raw natural gas escaping from oil and gas fields, not in Ohio, but out west, and thereby potentially reversing what's been thought to be a big advantage of producing electricity from natural gas relative to coal. Certainly the emissions of some of the most harmful emissions that cause acid rain and mercury and so on are just a fraction of what is coming from coal, no doubt. But what would have been ballyhooed as a big advantage now, I'm getting ahead of climate change, potentially is not when you look at the gas that is escaping out there in the well fields.
Okay, we got another audience question. Go ahead.
I don't know how much time we have. My name's Beth Crane.
Tom and I
but
act
have
like we got
two
all the time in the world.
You didn't talk about fresh water and the amount it takes for, and maybe that's not a concern anymore, but then my other concern was a long time ago I read about the New York and Pennsylvania outlawing the storage of their fracking water, and they were sending it to Ohio. Could you, is that true? And maybe you could comment on that and whether we're going to run out of space for
So New York
storage.
has a temporary moratorium. We've called for a moratorium here in Ohio until our laws and rules are up to snuff. We believe they ought to be, but New York has called for it, has a moratorium in place as they consider how they should best respond to natural gas, including the issues that you brought up. So, you have a ton of byproduct, and Ohio, in its wisdom, has now 130 or so, what is it, Tom, 180 disposal wells. 180, 199 or so. So we've been for 3 decades now accepting waste from in-state and from out-of-state. Got to go somewhere. But you also asked about the water supply issue and impact to waters. So one good thing, again, I'm feeling generous here today, Tom. I'm giving the Kasich administration credit. I guess you're giving them raspberries. But the Kasich administration asked for, the General Assembly approved, sort of a must ask, must tell. That is, when oil gas company wants to drill, the DNR is required to ask them, well, where is the source of water? These are thirsty operations. I think, was it 5 million gallons of water maybe per well, something like that?
For one day in the life of a 30-year life of a well.
Okay. So by law, the applicant must indicate, well, what's the source of the water? What's the shortcoming in Ohio law is the DNR has no authority to regulate or say no to what the water source is. That is, you can literally draw down a stream, and this has happened. The Columbus Dispatch has reported on this. But the DNR is powerless to say, no, don't withdraw from that stream. Now you'd think, well, what oil and gas company is going to withdraw from a stream they're going to draw down? I mean, that's why they're drawing. They want the water. Well, there's a difference between completely drying it up and drawing it down enough to be able to satisfy your needs, and yet potentially having an impact on that stream. So that authority does not exist in the law. That's a place we need to get in control of, and I'll yield my time here so we can get another question in.
I think we have time for one more.
I'm Teresa Allen. I'm a nurse. I am the chair and founder of the Blanchard Township Pearls, Protectors of Everyone's American Rural Lifestyle, vice president of the Blanchard River Watershed Partnership, former township trustee, commissioner candidate, well-versed on economic development. I have a couple concerns. Why, in all of this, with fracking, have the industry been resistant in releasing the MSDS sheet information on the chemicals used in injection? That's one question. And number two, I'd just like to remind this group, as we talk economic development, which is necessary for Ohio, for jobs, for growth, for our communities, let's not forget that all parts of Ohio should be considered and represented. And I include rural people and rural Ohio. Just as we fought a stone quarry and defeated them and defended our zoning over a 7-year period, one of the few communities in Ohio to do so, we learned about dewatering. So when we talk about fracking, there's a parallel. Nobody's home, farm, or business is worth anything if they're dewatered, and nobody's home, farm, or business is worth anything if their well is contaminated. So with all I've learned about hydrology and geology and economic development and responsible economic development, why shouldn't you be using your resources to use best available technology to do your business, to get the gas that you want to get or the oil, and protect the wells and the aquifer? Because in Ohio, for rural Ohioans, we don't have a public water treatment plant. We get our water from wells, and we deserve to be protected. And all of these wells and the aquifer do interconnect. And we have a right to demand and expect protection as we look at responsible economic development.
Okay, there's 2 questions, and they're running out of time. MSDS and water issues.
The state of Ohio was one of the very first states in Senate Bill 165 to do frac disclosure. And at that time, it was that you would submit the MSDS sheets of everything that you used into the DNR, and that they would post them on the website. So that's happening. During 315, the model was to jump that up and use what's called a frac focus concept. That's the national database that's sponsored by Groundwater Protection Council down in Oklahoma City. They maintain that along with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, in which you register down to the molecular level everything that you use. And that is the law in the state of Ohio that you need to do that, and producers, both vertical and horizontally, are complying with that law. Since then, a statement was issued by an organization called the Ohio State Medical Association. These are professionals for the physicians, and they believe that Senate Bill 315 that did the frac focus said that it permits medical professionals to obtain the information regarding the chemical compounds used in the operations of a well, and allows medical professionals to share this information with patients and other care providers and government. They think that this law gives them everything that's needed in order for them to protect their patients and their well-being and their obligations to society. So the medical community believes that we do have a good state of affairs here in the state of Ohio. The state of Ohio, the #1 obligation for the oil and gas regulatory program is to protect the freshwater aquifer. That's why you have casing and cementing programs. That's why we did Senate Bill 165. That was further upgraded with Senate Bill 315. Since 165, the oil and gas regulatory program in the state of Ohio has been subject to a peer critique review comparing it to other states by a national organization that included representatives of the environmental community, some in particular, including in-house counsel for Earthworks, who sits on their board. And they found that the oil and gas regulatory program in the state of Ohio, after critiquing it specifically for regulations dealing with hydraulic fracturing, well construction, piping, and casing, found that the oil and gas regulatory program is overall well managed and meets program objectives and has a lot to offer other states and how to do it right. And that was signed off on by the environmental community, people who knew what they were talking about.
Okay, Jack, last word. Quickly.
You asked a great question. Trade secrecy, it's interesting. This industry needs to go to the General Assembly and to get special carve-outs on trade secrecy and on medical right to know. I never heard the coal industry or another industry go and ask for that. Right to know, you have precious little, when it comes to injection wells, precious little right to be able to know about and be able to comment on in a timely manner. And thirdly, with these respective terms and conditions, coal law, you've got a right to challenge terms and conditions permits. Ain't got that specifically. You do not have that right. And furthermore, under oil and gas law, furthermore, where are these terms and conditions? You know, the steel industry, the coal industry, you name the industry would be having a conniption if the Ohio EPA hid the ball and did not disclose publicly these terms and conditions. Somehow, those terms and conditions are not publicly available. You can't easily search those when it comes to DNR oil and gas law.
Every oil and gas permit is a public record, Jack. And the
Can't appeal it.
And the oil,
Can't appeal it.
Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time here.
Are we?
So,
this is an interesting debate because Jack is sort of skewing what an oil and gas permit is. And an oil and gas permit is a finding by the Oil and Gas Regulatory Agency that you have complied with the law, both in spacing, well construction techniques, every aspect of the law and the requirement in order to drill that well. It's not a finding of whether your neighbor wants that well drilled or not, because the well's drilled on land where the landowners gave permission to come onto the land, vis-a-vis a legal contract called an oil and gas lease. So they have the right to be there.
Under coal, you got a right to appeal that permit. Oil and gas, you do not.
This is an interesting debate, and we can continue it in the
just
lobby
sneak up there.
over coffee and cookies. Tom, Jack, Mark, thank you very much for covering a difficult subject well.